Welcome to part 7 of the TAS tutorial. In this part, we'll be talking about cycles. So you might be wondering, what is a cycle? And basically, it is something in the game that moves in a pattern and repeats itself, and generally it'll stop you progressing until it's at a certain part of a cycle. So a classic example is something like a platform that you need to jump onto and it moves back and forth, and you can only jump onto it at a certain time. Or maybe something blocking your path that blocks and then unblocks your path. That's what a cycle is. Now, as you might imagine, these are really important to make sure you get to them at the right time, but there's actually quite a few different types of cycles. So the three main types that I've come across are global cycles, level cycles, and local cycles. Now, I'm not saying these are the only types of cycles possible, but this is roughly how you can categorize them. First of all, global cycles tend to run for the whole game. So as soon as you turn on the console or start your TAS, that global cycle is starting to tick over. Global cycles are generally the hardest type of cycle to deal with because sometimes it requires future planning in your TAS. Level cycles would begin at the start of the level. So generally, these are quite common. If you see individual level speedruns, you'll be seeing level cycles. And then local cycles are another step down. It's when the object comes on screen or loads in, that's when the cycle will start. So we're going to look at some examples of all of these types of cycles. Okay, the first example I want to talk about of cycles is global cycles. Now, what global cycles are is they start from when you power on the game, usually, and they just keep going up. So what we're looking at here is a global cycle in Crash, and a lot of things in this game use global cycles, this global cycle variable. So the first thing that uses it is, for example, this goat. The goat itself doesn't really matter, but this is an example of where it can be useful. So you can see if I freeze that, the goat's just sort of chilling there, not really moving back and forth. And then if I unfreeze it again, it goes on. So yeah, that's an example of one thing that would use a global cycle. And where this comes into play is later on in the game in a water level, we have this spinning disk, which once again uses the exact same variable for the global cycle. You can see if I freeze that where it is there, I cannot get past this disk to get down into the later bit of the level. It's a pretty big issue. So when I made this TAS, I had to actually plan ahead and make sure that I reached this disk at a good global cycle. Now, the big issue with Crash is we have the choice of what order we play the levels in. So level 2 is where that spinning disc is, and I had to try different orders of playing the levels until I got one that worked. Unfortunately, that means that sometimes I had to TAS the same level multiple times. So that actually made this quite a difficult TAS game to do because of that global cycle. It was actually quite a big issue. But luckily in the TAS I managed to find one that worked and get past it extremely quickly. Yeah, so that's where global cycles can really come into play, and they're often the hardest to deal with. One other thing that I'll show you that's kind of fun is when you set a global cycle to be too high, sometimes it can cause some weird stuff to happen. So I'm going to set this to be with an 8 at the start, which the game's sort of going to read it as a negative number. And yeah, the goat's not very happy. So it's doing a bit of a moonwalk there. So this is another thing that's really fun that you can do with global cycles is sometimes if you set them to a ridiculously high number, weird stuff will happen. Now, if you had to actually wait for this to get to this number, I think it takes something like 2 years. So it's not ever going to be useful for any reason, but it's just a fun little thing that you can do with it. The other thing about global cycles that I'll mention is sometimes, and this game is an example of it, sometimes when you die, the global cycle will reset. So in this game, when you die, it resets, or if you reset the console, it resets. I believe as well in this game, when you start a time trial level, the global cycle will reset as well. If you're familiar with Crash 3, the time trial levels are your second go through when you get a clock. So yeah, those are global cycles. They come up quite a bit, and they're really important to look out for. Okay, while we're on the topic of global cycles, I'm going to talk about probably the most famous global cycle in speedrunning, which is the 21 frame rule from Mario Brothers. So just before we start on this, I want to point out a really good resource. TAS videos will often have a game resources page for more popular games. So this page has all the tech for Mario, including a big RAM watch with all the addresses that you might need. The one we're looking at is the 21 frame rule. And I don't know why, but they've given the address in decimal rather than hex. So if we want it in hex, it's 77F, which is what we'll need to put into our RAM watch. So just looking here, we've got our RAM watch at 77F is this frame rule. Now, just keep an eye on it up here. What it does is it ticks down from 20, and then you can't progress to the next level until it hits a certain spot of that cycle. So what will happen when I jump on the flag is we'll go into the castle and it'll wait for the frame rule to hit, I think it's 0, before it progresses to the next level. Now, I can demonstrate this because if I freeze the frame rule at 5, the game should not progress at all to the next level. So we'll have a look at what that looks like. Timer ticks down, level ends, and we're not going anywhere. It's just going to stay there until the frame rule hits 0, which of course that will never happen because I've got it frozen. If I set the frame rule to 0, then we immediately progress. So if I keep it at 0, you should see that we'll actually progress quite quickly. There we go. And yeah, so what that means is that whenever you do a level in Mario, you can only save time in chunks of 21 frames, which is about 1/3 of a second. So it means you'll never save a little bit of time, you'll only save 21 frames at a time. Which actually means that saving any time on this TAS is really difficult because you have to reach the next frame rule. A common analogy is that the castle is like a bus station, and there's a bus that takes you to the next level, but it only comes every 21 frames. So if you want to save time, you've got to catch the next bus, the next soonest bus. Now, you might be wondering, doesn't this seem like an individual level cycle? And that's kind of true. So the frame rule is technically a global cycle because it just keeps ticking all the time that you're playing the game. But in practice, it's actually a individual level cycle because it'll start at the same spot on a new level every time. The reason for that, though, is, of course, the frame rule has to hit 0 for you to go to the next level. So that means you're always going to get into the next level on the same spot of a frame rule. So it's kind of a weird mix between a global cycle and a level cycle. Doesn't really matter. The point is, it prevents you from going through to the next level until it's time. And it's another example of a cycle. Before we talk about level cycles, I want to talk about local cycles. Now, these might seem a bit unfamiliar and might be a bit surprising. So a local cycle is what happened. It's a cycle that starts as soon as you load the object. So a good example is from Sonic on the Game Gear. There's a certain platform in this level that only starts moving once you get close enough to it. So I should be able to stop it from moving until I jump up to a certain height, which is that height there. And you can see it's this platform going up and down here. If I freeze that cycle, we can see that this definitely does refer to that platform because freezing it freezes it in place. So the very fancy thing about this is it doesn't matter how fast we get through the level. What actually matters is how quickly we can get this platform moving. So if I go back to where I was before the platform started moving and I freeze it at 160, that's actually quite bad because it will never move down for Sonic to get picked up by it. You can see it's still going to be all the way up in the air there. That first platform has not come down yet. So what we actually need to do, it's actually all the way up here, so there's no way we're going to jump to it in time. So what we actually need to do is get high enough that the cycle starts as soon as we can. So what I want to point out is the bit in the TAS where I do this, and you can see some really weird looking movement. The reason is to get the cycle to start as soon as possible, because the sooner that platform starts moving, the sooner we can jump on it and the sooner we can finish the level. So we'll see right here, I'm going to do a little bit more of a jump than necessary to get the platform down. Now I'll slow that right down so we can have a look at it, and I'll point out exactly what I mean. Okay, so we're about to jump up, and you can see once I land on this platform, it would be beneficial to just completely run to the right, and it would actually be faster. But what I'm actually going to do is do a little jump there. Reason being, jumping will load that platform cycle as soon as possible. So that platform's loaded now, which means it's coming down sooner, which means that I can then jump up onto it, just barely making it. So that's a local cycle. You'll see them quite a bit. Local cycles are actually very nice to deal with because it only depends on what you do in that one bit of the TAS. It doesn't matter about anything else, meaning you can really optimize that one section in isolation. The problem with something like a global cycle is you could have to go back really far in the TAS to make everything line up. Local cycles, you don't need to do that. But just be aware of when local cycles start and when the thing loads in, because you might be able to do cheeky little things like a bit of an extra jump, like I did there, to actually save yourself a little bit of time. Alright, now the last type of cycle we need to talk about is level cycles. So conveniently, that brings us right back to the TAS we've been working on. So if you recall, we've been working on Mickey Mouse Castle Evolution, just the practice mode, and we're going to find some level cycles. So the reason that I'm talking about level cycles now is that these platforms here seem to operate on level cycles, which we can test to confirm. So we're going to load the fresh level like this, and we're just going to see what happens. So let's start a new RAM search here. We're going to find the platform's X coordinate. So it should be a bit bigger because it's moved to the right. Again, it should be a bit bigger because we've moved to the right. We're going to get it all the way to the right. And then we're going to look for a less than because it's moved to the left now. And it seems like these are the bytes that we're looking at. 0460, 048D. So let's try freezing 0460 and see if that stops the platform from moving. It does not. Now let's try 048D. Ah, cool, that stopped the platform from moving. So we'll go ahead and we'll add that to the RAM watch, and that seems to be our platform X. Okay, but there isn't just one platform, there's actually two platforms here. The second platform is this one here. Now, actually, it turns out, I think we may have already found this in our RAM search. Let's try freezing 046D again. Oh my goodness, it's the other platform. So that's frozen. And the weird thing is, what that's actually measuring is its X position on screen, which is a weird thing to measure, but there we go. So that's not necessarily the cycle value, that's its X value, but the X value should be good enough for what we're trying to do here. And it looks like if I freeze it, then some weird shenanigans happens. So let's go into TAS Studio and start working on some of this stuff. Yes, I do want to save changes to the RAM watch. I believe I accidentally just got rid of that second cycle. 048D, I believe the other one was 046D. So platform 2. Make sure everything's unfrozen before we start doing our TASing. And here we go. So let's just keep an eye on platform X and platform 2. And it looks like they're set at 0 for the majority of our TAS. So it'll be interesting to see if anything changes. 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. And they start moving immediately as soon as we get into the room. So these are level cycles. We can see both platforms are moving as soon as we get into the room. There's nothing we can do to speed those up, and we want to get on the platforms as soon as possible. Now that these platforms are done, we can try TASing just a little bit of this level. So we've already jumped on there. You can see that we'll go to the left and jump out, and we'll go to the left and we will drop down. There's pretty much nothing we can do to make this go any quicker because these are individual level cycles. If these are global cycles, then it's something different to talk about. So I'd encourage you, if you're following along with TASing Castle Evolution, Do give this a go, these platforms, and just see how you can go with them. They shouldn't be too difficult to optimize because they're just level cycles. What would be different is if they were a global cycle or a local cycle. Also, if these platforms were a bit later in the level, it would also be a bit trickier because we'd have to do the level really quickly and try and reach this cycle. So there's a lot to think about with cycles there. Okay, now we've seen all three types of cycles. We had our global cycles, like in Crash Bandicoot or Super Mario Bros. We had our local cycles, like our platform in Sonic the Hedgehog, and we had our level cycles, like in Castle of Illusion. Now, you should be okay as long as you can recognize which type of cycle you're dealing with in a TAS and plan ahead. Just be sure that you've got something related to your cycle in RAM so that you can keep an eye on how it's going throughout. So yeah, as long as you're aware and you're sure which type it is, just make sure that you're doing some planning ahead to optimize for your cycle. And as long as you know about your cycles in advance, you shouldn't have too much trouble. They can sometimes be frustrating when you have to redo things in a TAS, but if you're starting a TAS, just have a look and see if there's any cycles in your game, have a think about them, and if you've got any freedom in the routing of your game, try out some different routing to try and deal with the cycle in the best way possible. So once again, thanks for watching. I appreciate all the support from the viewers, and if you're interested in TASing, feel free to subscribe to my channel and check out some of the other content on there.